in the merciless frontier lands of the American West, where the sun scorches the earth by day and the cold cuts through bone by night, legends are born not from glory, but from the crucible of human desperation. This is the story of a man who had lost everything: his purpose, his place in the world, his very identity. Yet in the most unlikely of circumstances, protecting strangers who owed him nothing, he would discover something he never knew he was searching for: a home. What drives a man to risk everything for people he's never met? What transforms a wandering soul into a protector, a guardian, a brother? Sometimes the answer lies not in what we seek, but in what finds us when we least expect it. This is the tale of Ethan Cole, the outcast cowboy who found his shelter in the most dangerous of times, with the most unlikely of companions. But before we begin, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. The desert wind carried secrets across the badlands of Arizona Territory, whispering through sagebrush and over sun-bleached bones of cattle that had died seeking water. Ethan Cole sat motionless on his paint horse at the edge of Howling Stones Canyon, his weathered hands gripping the reins as his gray eyes scanned the horizon. At 34, his face bore the marks of a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. Deep lines etched by squinting against dust storms, a scar running from his left temple to his jaw, and eyes that held the weight of countless disappointed dawns. 3 years had passed since he'd hung up his Army tracker's badge. 3 years of drifting from town to town like tumblewood, never staying long enough for anyone to learn his story. The frontier was harsh to all men, but it was particularly unforgiving to those who belonged nowhere. Ethan had learned that lesson the hard way. "Easy, Smoke," he murmured to his horse, feeling the animal's restlessness beneath him. Even his mount sensed the tension in the air, the way the canyon walls seemed to hold their breath. Something wasn't right here. Ethan dismounted, his worn leather boots hitting the rocky ground with practiced silence. His movements were economical, each gesture born from years of survival in hostile territory. He'd learned to read the land like scripture. Every broken twig, every displaced stone, every shift in the wind told a story to those who knew how to listen. Kneeling beside a cluster of tracks near the canyon's mouth, Ethan's trained eye immediately cataloged the details: moccasins, small and light, moving fast, a child's footprints, an older man with a slight limp, and a woman carrying something heavy, probably supplies. They were running, not walking. Behind them, several sets of boot prints, spaced wide apart. Mounted men in pursuit. Trouble, Ethan whispered to himself, a familiar knot forming in his stomach. In his years as an Army scout, he'd seen this pattern too many times. Settlers fleeing raiders, soldiers chasing deserters, bounty hunters tracking escaped prisoners. But something about these particular tracks felt different, more desperate. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the jagged peaks of the distant mountains when Ethan heard it. The faint echo of voices carried on the wind. Not the casual conversation of travelers, but the urgent, hushed tones of people trying to stay hidden. His military instincts kicked in, and he found himself moving toward the sounds before his conscious mind had made the decision. Tethering Smoke to a twisted juniper, Ethan made his way deeper into the canyon on foot. The walls rose around him like ancient sentinels, their red sandstone faces bearing the scars of millennia. His boots found purchase on the narrow ledges with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat, years of frontier living having honed his natural agility. As he rounded a bend in the canyon, Ethan caught sight of them. A small family had taken shelter in a shallow cave about 50 feet below his position. An elderly Native American man, with steel-gray braids, sat guard at the cave's entrance, his weathered hands gripping a well-maintained rifle. Behind him, a young woman cradled a boy who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, her dark eyes constantly scanning the canyon rim above them. The woman, Kiona, though Ethan didn't know her name yet, was perhaps 25, with the kind of quiet strength that came from enduring hardship without breaking. Her long black hair was braided with small beads that caught what little sunlight filtered into the cave, and her buckskin dress was travel-stained but well-made. The child in her arms, little Bear, pressed close to his mother, his small face buried against her shoulder. The elderly man, Gray Eagle, moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had lived long enough to understand the value of patience, but his alert posture suggested he was far from helpless. Every few minutes, his head would tilt slightly, listening for sounds that younger ears might miss. Ethan was about to retreat, to leave these strangers to their troubles, when the sound of approaching hooves echoed through the canyon. Many horses, moving fast. The family below tensed, and Ethan saw the woman pull her son closer, her hand moving instinctively to a knife at her belt. "They found us," Gray Eagle said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "We cannot run anymore, daughter. The boy is too tired." Kiona's response was fierce but low. "Then we fight, father. We do not let them take us." "Against 8 men?" Gray Eagle shook his head sadly. "We are brave, but we are not foolish." 8 men. Ethan's jaw tightened as he considered the odds. He'd faced worse, but barely. And he'd had an entire army unit behind him then. Not just his own skills and whatever conscience still flickered in his hollow chest. The riders appeared at the canyon's mouth, like harbingers of death. Even from his elevated position, Ethan could make out their leader, a tall man with a black hat and a coat that had once been fine but was now stained with dust and something darker. The way he sat his horse, the casual cruelty in his posture, marked him as a killer. "Cain," Ethan breathed, recognizing the man even at this distance. Silas the Butcher Cain, wanted in 3 territories for murder, rape, and worse. If Cain was hunting this family, they weren't random victims, they were targets. The next few minutes would haunt Ethan for the rest of his life. He watched as Cain and his men systematically searched the canyon, their movements suggesting they knew their prey was here somewhere. He heard Cain's voice, cold and mocking, as he called out to the hidden family. Come out, little rabbits." Cain's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "You can't hide forever. We know you're here." Ethan's hands were trembling, though whether from rage or fear, he couldn't say. He could leave. Should leave. This wasn't his fight. These weren't his people, and he'd learned long ago that playing hero only led to heartbreak and graves. But then Little Bear whimpered, a small sound of terror that pierced through Ethan's carefully constructed emotional armor, like an arrow, finding its mark. In that moment, the hollow place in his chest, the void where his purpose used to live, suddenly flared with something he thought was dead. He couldn't walk away. Not from this. Not again. Ethan Cole had approximately 3 minutes before Cain's men spotted the cave where the family was hiding. 3 minutes to decide whether he would remain the hollow man he'd become, or remember who he used to be before the world had carved the heart out of him. His mind raced through possibilities with the cold efficiency of his old army training. 8 armed men, probably experienced killers, against 1 tracker with a rifle and a 6-shooter. The odds were suicide, but Ethan had learned long ago that sometimes suicide and heroism looked exactly the same from the outside. Moving with practiced stealth, Ethan positioned himself on a rocky outcropping that would give him a clear line of sight to the canyon floor. His Winchester rifle felt familiar in his hands, an old friend that had never failed him when death came calling. Below, he could see Cain directing his men to search every crevice and shadow. "Spread out," Cain commanded, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man who had never met an obstacle he couldn't overcome with violence. "They're here somewhere. That old tracker in Tucson said they'd head for the high country, and this is the only water for 20 miles. Ethan's blood ran cold. A tracker in Tucson had given away the family's route. That meant Cain wasn't just hunting randomly. This was planned, deliberate. Whatever these people had done or witnessed, someone wanted them silenced permanently. One of Cain's men, a wiry fellow with a missing eye, dismounted near the base of the cave. He was maybe 30 seconds from discovering the family's hiding place when Ethan made his choice. The Winchester's report echoed through the canyon like thunder, and the one-eyed man dropped without a sound. Chaos erupted below as Cain's remaining men scrambled for cover, their horses rearing and screaming in terror. "Sniper!" Cain roared, his head swiveling as he tried to locate the source of the shot. Find him. But Ethan was already moving, using every trick he'd learned in his army days to stay ahead of return fire. A second shot dropped another of Cain's men, This one a bearded giant who'd been raising his rifle toward the cave. From his hiding place, Gray Eagle emerged slightly, his old eyes wide with surprise and hope. He'd lived long enough to recognize the sound of salvation when it came calling, even from an unexpected source. "Who fights for us?" Kiona whispered, clutching Little Bear tighter. "I do not know," Gray Eagle replied, working the action on his own rifle. "But we must help him. He cannot face them all alone." The battle that followed was unlike anything in the dime novels that young men read back east. There was no glory in it, no noble speeches or dramatic poses. It was raw, desperate violence punctuated by the smell of gunpowder and the metallic taste of fear. Ethan used every advantage the terrain offered, moving from position to position like a ghost, appearing long enough to fire a shot before melting back into the rocks. His years of hunting Apache war parties served him well. He knew how to think like a predator and move like smoke. Kane, for all his cruelty, was no fool. After losing 2 more men to Ethan's rifle, he changed tactics. Instead of pursuing the sniper directly, he sent his remaining men to flush out the family. "You want to play games?" Kane shouted toward the rocks, where he thought Ethan was hiding. "Fine, but for every shot you take at my men, I'm going to cut off one of the woman's fingers. Starting now." The threat hit Ethan like a physical blow. He'd seen Kane's handiwork before, knew the man would make good on his promise. But he also knew that revealing himself meant certain death for everyone. That's when Gray Eagle made his own choice. The old warrior emerged from the cave with a war cry that seemed to shake the very stones of the canyon. His ancient rifle barked once, twice, dropping one of Kane's men before the others could react. But Gray Eagle was 70 years old, and while his spirit was unbroken, his body couldn't match his courage. Kane's return shot took the old man in the chest, spinning him around. He fell heavily, blood staining the cave's entrance. "Father!" Kiona's scream of anguish echoed through the canyon, and Little Bear's terrified wails followed. Something inside Ethan snapped, not broke, but snapped back into place. The hollow man ceased to exist, replaced by the protector he'd once been, the guardian he'd forgotten how to be. What followed was less a battle than an execution. Ethan emerged from the rocks like an avenging spirit, his rifle speaking with deadly accuracy. Years of suppressed rage and guilt found expression in each perfectly placed shot. Kane's men, caught between the need to return fire and the instinct to flee, made perfect targets. Within moments, only Kane himself remained, crouched behind a boulder with his fancy coat torn and his black hat lost in the dust. "Come out, Kane," Ethan called, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You wanted to fight. Here I am." Kane emerged slowly, his hands raised but his eyes calculating. Even cornered, he was looking for an angle, a way to turn the situation to his advantage. "You made a mistake, friend," Kane said, his voice smooth as silk. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I've got backing from important men, territorial officials, army officers, businessmen. You kill me, and they'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." Ethan stepped closer, his rifle trained on Kane's chest. "Funny thing about important men," he said quietly. "They tend to forget the names of hired killers real quick when those killers start causing them embarrassment." Kane's facade cracked slightly. "What do you want? Money? I can pay you more than whatever they're offering." "They're not offering me anything," Ethan replied. "And that's what makes this so simple." The final shot echoed through the canyon, followed by a silence so profound it seemed to have weight. Kane fell backward into the dust, his reign of terror ended by a man who'd been dead inside until 3 strangers reminded him what it meant to be alive. Ethan lowered his rifle and turned toward the cave, where Kiona knelt beside her fallen father, her tears falling onto his still chest. Little Bear clung to his mother, no longer crying but staring at Ethan with wide, wondering eyes. The sun was setting behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed to mirror the blood that had been spilled on the desert floor. Ethan Cole knelt beside Gray Eagle's still form, his weathered hands checking for signs of life that he knew he wouldn't find. "He's gone," Ethan said softly, though Kiona had stopped hoping minutes ago. Her tears had dried, replaced by the stoic acceptance that frontier life demanded of its survivors. Little Bear pressed closer to his mother, his small hand gripping her buckskin dress. "He died defending his family," Kiona said, her voice steady despite her grief. "It is a good death. He would not have wanted to die in his sleep like an old dog." Ethan studied the woman before him, impressed despite himself by her strength. He'd seen grown men crumble under less pressure, but Kiona seemed to be made of different stuff, the kind of steel that was forged in the furnace of hardship and tempered by loss. "We need to move," Ethan said, rising to his feet. "Kane's men might have friends following their trail. This place isn't safe anymore." Kiona nodded, then looked at him with eyes that held both gratitude and wariness. "Why did you help us, white man? We are strangers to you." It was a fair question, and one that Ethan wasn't sure he could answer. Why had he risked his life for people he'd never met? Why had he thrown away 3 years of careful anonymity to fight a battle that wasn't his? "Sometimes a man doesn't get to choose his battles," Ethan said finally. "Sometimes they choose him." Working together in the growing darkness, they buried Gray Eagle in a shallow grave marked with stones arranged in the pattern of his tribe. Kiona sang a low, mournful song in her native language, while Little Bear placed a handful of wildflowers on the mound. "What's your name?" Ethan asked as they prepared to leave the canyon. "I am Kiona," she replied. "This is my son, Little Bear, and you are the man who saved our lives." "Ethan Cole," he said simply. "Where were you headed when Kane found your trail?" "North, to the high country where my father's people wait. The reservation." She spat the word like a curse. "The reservation is no place for my son to grow up. We were seeking the free bands, the ones who still live as our ancestors did." Ethan nodded. He'd heard rumors of native groups who'd refused the government's offers of sanctuary on designated lands, choosing instead to maintain their traditional ways in remote areas where federal authority was little more than a distant threat. "It's a hard trail," he warned. "Weeks of traveling through country that doesn't forgive mistakes. Harder than staying to be hunted like animals." Kiona challenged. "My son deserves better than a life spent looking over his shoulder." Over the next several days, as they made their way through increasingly rugged terrain, Ethan began to understand the depth of what this small family had endured. Their story emerged in fragments, told around carefully concealed campfires or during brief rest stops in the shade of red rock formations. Gray Eagle had been a respected leader among his people, but he'd made the mistake of speaking out against a corrupt Indian agent who was selling government supplies meant for the reservation. The agent, backed by men like Kane, had decided that some voices needed to be permanently silenced. "They came in the night," Kiona explained as they climbed a narrow mountain trail, Little Bear riding on Ethan's horse while she walked alongside. "Father saw them coming and woke us. We escaped through the smoke hole while they burned our lodge." "How long have you been running?" Ethan asked. 2 months. We've been living like coyotes, hiding in caves, eating roots and whatever small game we could catch. But they always found us. Always." Little Bear, who had been silent for most of their journey, suddenly spoke up. "Are the bad men gone forever now?" Ethan met the boy's trusting gaze and felt something twist in his chest. In that moment, he realized that his hollow days were truly over. This child, this family, had become his responsibility, not through any formal agreement, but through the kind of bond that was forged in shared danger and sealed with spilled blood. "They're gone," Ethan promised. "I won't let anyone hurt you." As they traveled deeper into the wilderness, Ethan found himself sharing stories of his own past. He told them about his days as an Army scout, about the battles he'd fought, and the friends he'd lost. He spoke of his wife Sarah, killed by raiders while he was away on patrol, and how her death had carved the hollow place in his heart where hope used to live. Kiona listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that showed she understood the weight of his words. Little Bear, meanwhile, began to emerge from his shell, showing Ethan how to identify edible plants and pointing out animal tracks with the enthusiasm of a natural-born tracker. "You know this land well," Ethan observed one evening as they camped beside a hidden spring. "My grandfather taught me," Little Bear said proudly. "Before he got shot, He showed me the secret places where the water is sweet and the spirits are kind. Your grandfather was a wise man, Ethan replied. He raised a brave family. On the 7th day of their journey, they encountered their first real test as a group. A rock slide had blocked their intended path through a mountain pass, forcing them to choose between a dangerous detour that would add days to their journey, or attempting to clear enough debris to squeeze through. The boy can't make it over those rocks, Kiona said, studying the treacherous alternative route. But we don't have enough food to last if we go around. Ethan spent the next 6 hours moving stones, some as large as wagon wheels, while Kiona and Little Bear helped with the smaller debris. His hands were bloody by the time they'd cleared a passage, but the look of admiration in Little Bear's eyes made every cut worthwhile. You are strong like a bear, the boy announced solemnly. Grandfather would have liked you. That night, as they sat around their small fire, Kiona studied Ethan with new eyes. You could have left us after the canyon. Why didn't you? Ethan poked at the fire with a stick, considering his answer. Man gets to a point in his life where he has to decide what he's worth. I spent 3 years thinking I wasn't worth much of anything. Maybe I was wrong. The spirits sent you to us, Kiona said with quiet conviction. My father always said that when the darkness comes, the light finds a way to shine through. You are our light, Ethan Cole. Little Bear had fallen asleep against Ethan's side, his small body warm and trusting. As Ethan looked down at the boy's peaceful face, he realized that somewhere in the past week, his entire world had changed. He was no longer a man without purpose, without belonging. He was a protector, a guardian, a member of a family that had adopted him as surely as if he'd been born to them. The hollow place in his chest wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something he'd almost forgotten how to feel: love. 2 weeks after leaving Howling Stones Canyon, Ethan Cole stood on a ridge overlooking a hidden valley that seemed to exist outside the reach of the civilized world. Below, scattered among groves of aspen and pine, he could see the lodges and teepees of the free band Kiona had been seeking, her father's people, who had chosen the hardships of freedom over the false security of reservation life. Little Bear pressed close to Ethan's side, his small hand gripping the cowboy's calloused fingers. The boy had grown during their journey, not just in size but in confidence, learning to trust again after the trauma of being hunted. They're beautiful, Little Bear whispered, watching children play by the stream that wound through the valley floor, just like grandfather described. Kiona stood slightly apart, her emotions carefully controlled. For 2 months she dreamed of this moment, but now that it was here, Ethan could see the uncertainty in her posture. Would her father's people accept them? Would they welcome a white man who'd attached himself to their small family? Second thoughts. Ethan asked quietly. No, Kiona replied firmly. This is where we belong, where Little Bear belongs. But you. She turned to face him, her dark eyes reflecting weeks of unspoken questions. What will you do now? Your job is finished. We are safe. The question hit Ethan like a physical blow, though he'd been expecting it for days. What would he do? For 3 weeks he'd had a purpose, a mission that gave meaning to each sunrise. Now that the family was safe, what became of the hollow man who'd found his heart in their company? I suppose I'll move on, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Find some other trail to follow. Little Bear looked up at him with stricken eyes. You're leaving us? Before Ethan could answer, a group of riders emerged from the valley below, moving up the trail toward their position. Kiona tensed, her hand moving instinctively toward her knife, but then her posture relaxed as she recognized the lead rider. Standing Wolf, she called out in greeting as the group approached. Brother of my father's heart. The man who dismounted was perhaps 50 years old, with gray-streaked braids and eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of decades spent reading the intentions of both men and nature. His gaze moved from Kiona to Little Bear to Ethan, lingering on the white man with obvious curiosity. Kiona, daughter of Gray Eagle, Standing Wolf said formally. We felt the shadow of your father's passing 2 weeks ago. Our hearts are heavy with grief. He died as he lived, Kiona replied with quiet pride, protecting his family. Standing Wolf nodded solemnly, then turned his attention to Ethan. And this one? He has the look of a warrior about him, but his skin is pale. "This is Ethan Cole," Kiona said, her voice carrying a note of fierce protectiveness that surprised even her. "He saved our lives. He is the reason Little Bear and I stand before you now." Grandfather would have called him brother, Little Bear added with the earnest conviction that only children possess. Standing Wolf studied Ethan for a long moment, taking in the weathered face, the calloused hands, the way he held himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd walked through fire and emerged still standing. "Come," Standing Wolf said finally. "There will be time for stories when the council gathers tonight." The descent into the valley was like entering a different world. Children ran alongside their horses, laughing and calling out greetings to Kiona and staring with wide-eyed fascination at Ethan. Women emerged from their lodges to embrace the returning daughter of Grey Eagle, their voices rising in a keening song of welcome and mourning combined. Ethan felt like an intruder in this sacred space, a pale ghost haunting the edges of something beautiful and pure. But Little Bear remained close to his side, the boy's presence serving as both anchor and validation. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountain peaks, the entire band gathered around a great fire built in the center of the village. Ethan sat slightly apart from the circle, close enough to hear, but far enough to avoid intruding on tribal business. Standing Wolf rose and addressed the assembly in their native language, his words punctuated by murmurs of agreement and nods of understanding. Though Ethan couldn't understand the specific words, he caught the general meaning. Kiona was telling the story of their escape, of Grey Eagle's death, and of the white man who'd risked everything to save strangers. When she finished, an elderly woman with silver braids stood and spoke at length, her voice carrying the authority of years. Other members of the band added their own comments, creating a complex conversation that flowed around Ethan like a river around a stone. Finally, Standing Wolf turned to address Ethan directly, switching to English out of courtesy. "White man," he said formally, "Kiona tells us you fought like 10 warriors to save her family. She says you killed the evil one called Cain and his men, though you had no obligation to do so. Is this true?" "It's true," Ethan replied simply. "Why?" The question came from the elderly woman, spoken in heavily accented English. "Why risk your life for strangers?" It was the same question Kiona had asked in the canyon, and Ethan still didn't have a perfect answer. How could he explain the hollow place that had been eating at him for years? How could he describe the moment when Little Bear's whimper had cracked something open in his chest and let the light in? "Sometimes," Ethan said slowly, "a man has to choose between who he's been and who he wants to be. I chose to be someone worth being." His words were translated for those who didn't speak English, and Ethan saw nods of understanding ripple through the gathering. These people knew something about choosing between easy survival and difficult honor. Standing Wolf conferred quietly with several other men, their voices too low for Ethan to hear. Finally, the leader stood again and faced Ethan with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of momentous decision. "Ethan Cole," Standing Wolf said formally, "you have proven yourself to be a man of honor. You protected our daughter and grandson when they had no one else to turn to. You fought their enemies as if they were your own enemies. You guided them through dangers that would have claimed lesser men." Ethan waited, hardly daring to breathe. "Our people have a saying," Standing Wolf continued. "The heart chooses its own family, and family is not always born of blood. Your heart chose to protect Grey Eagle's family. Their hearts chose to trust you with their lives. Perhaps it is time for all hearts to choose what comes next." The leader paused, and in that silence, Ethan could hear his own pulse thundering in his ears. "We offer you a place among us, Ethan Cole. Not as a visitor, not as a guest, but as one of our own. You have shown that courage and honor can exist in any color of skin, and we would be honored to call you brother." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. For 3 years he'd wandered without purpose, without belonging, without hope. He'd convinced himself that he was meant to be alone, that the hollow place in his chest was permanent and unfillable. But here, in this hidden valley, surrounded by people who'd accepted him based on his actions rather than his ancestry, Ethan felt something he'd thought was lost forever: home. Little Bear had crept closer during Standing Wolf's speech, and now the boy reached up to take Ethan's hand. "Will you stay with us?" Little Bear asked, his young voice carrying the weight of desperate hope. "Will you be my protector forever?" Ethan looked down at the child who'd become like a son to him, then at Kiona, whose smile was radiant with joy, then at the faces around the fire, faces that reflected acceptance, respect, and the promise of belonging. The hollow man was gone, replaced by someone Ethan barely recognized but liked immensely, a guardian, a protector, a man with a family and a purpose. "Yes," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll stay, for as long as you'll have me." The cheer that went up from the gathering seemed to shake the stars themselves. Little Bear threw his arms around Ethan's waist, and Kiona stepped forward to place her hands on his shoulders. "Welcome home, brother," she said softly. As the celebration continued around him, Ethan Cole sat by the fire and marveled at the strange turns life could take. He'd entered Howling Stones Canyon as an outcast cowboy with nothing to live for. He was leaving it as part of a family, a protector, a man who'd found his shelter in the most unexpected place imaginable. The wind still whispered across the frontier lands, carrying secrets and promises, and the dreams of those brave enough to chase them. But for the first time in years, Ethan wasn't listening for what the wind might take away. He was listening for what it might bring home. Years later, when the children of the band would gather around the evening fires to hear the old stories, they would speak of the pale warrior who'd arrived like a spirit sent by the ancestors. They'd tell of his courage in the canyon, his loyalty during the long journey, and the way he'd chosen love over loneliness when offered a place among them. But Ethan Cole knew the truth was simpler than legend. He hadn't saved Kiona and Little Bear. They'd saved him. In protecting them, he'd found his own protection. In giving them shelter, he'd discovered his own home. The outcast cowboy had become exactly what he'd always been meant to be: a guardian, a friend, and a man who understood that sometimes the greatest shelter isn't a place at all. Sometimes it's the people who choose to keep you safe, just as you choose to keep them safe in return, forever and always. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug and see you soon.